For many years, Union Pacific's Big Boy reigned supreme across the mountain railways, consuming 11 tons of coal and 12,000 gallons of water each hour. Its steam crews toiled through grueling shifts just to maintain the flow of freight. Then emerged a new contender, a gas turbine locomotive, conceived with the ambitious vision of the jet age, aiming to render both steam technology and the Big Boy obsolete. The potential it offered was immense: greater horsepower with fewer personnel, fueled by concepts as audacious as the era itself. So, what led to this pioneering marvel? Once prophesied to supplant the older behemoths, quietly fading into obscurity and disappearing in under a generation. What transpired between those lofty aspirations and the stark reality the railroad ultimately confronted? To understand this, we must first appreciate the substantial burden imposed by steam power. Every mile across the high plains of Wyoming demanded far more than sheer strength from the magnificent Big Boy. Records indicate that a single engine operating at full throttle consumed 11 tons of coal and 12,000 gallons of water per hour. This wasn't merely a statistic. It necessitated a continuous procession of water tankers, coal hoppers, and round-the-clock crews. Such a prodigious appetite profoundly influenced every section of track it traversed. Each journey over Sherman Hill required the constant vigilance of dozens of men. Firemen continuously shoveled coal, engineers meticulously monitored gauges, and water tenders raced to replenish tanks before the boiler ran dry. The demands didn't end within the locomotive's cab. Along the route, coaling towers and water columns stood like sentinels, erected to satisfy the insatiable hunger of these machines. Payroll records from the 1950s detail hundreds of employees, engineers, firemen, hustlers, and maintenance gangs, all pivotal to the daily ritual of steam operation. Every shift involved hours spent clearing ash from fireboxes, inspecting boiler tubes for leaks, and repairing worn running gear. Even a rapid turnaround required a significant workforce. The cost of keeping the Big Boy operational extended far beyond just fuel. Labor, infrastructure, and maintenance consumed financial resources and manpower that railroads could no longer readily allocate. By the late 1940s, the financial implications were stark. Greater expenditure for reduced flexibility, and more personnel required for every mile covered. While other industries rapidly advanced with new technologies, the railway giants appeared to be slower, heavier, and more expensive. With each passing year, the imperative to discover a more economical and straightforward method of freight transport became inescapable. The quest for a new form of power, one capable of surpassing the Big Boy without the accompanying logistical demands, transformed from a mere hope into an urgent necessity. General Electric's design office was consumed by a single, revolutionary question. What if a freight train could be propelled with the same force that propelled jet aircraft through the sky? In 1948, Union Pacific and General Electric engineers began to formulate an answer. Their strategy was both direct and bold. Instead of burning coal to generate steam, a gas turbine, essentially a jet engine operating terrestrially, would spin at thousands of revolutions per minute. This rotating shaft would power a generator, which would then transmit electricity directly to the traction motors on each axle. As one engineer described it, it was akin to having a jet engine turn a giant electric drill, with the wheels performing the actual work. Early communications between General Electric and Union Pacific highlighted the appeal. The turbine lacked pistons, a firebox, and an intricate array of moving rods. Fewer moving parts theoretically meant less wear and tear. Moreover, a single turbine unit would eliminate the need for double-heading steam giants over mountainous terrain. The promise was unequivocal: more power from one machine, fewer crew members in the cab, and a future free from the endless cycle of ash removal and boiler maintenance. Engineers envisioned a locomotive capable of hauling the longest, heaviest trains effortlessly over Sherman Hill. The turbine's voracious appetite would be satisfied by bunker C oil, an inexpensive, dense byproduct from the bottom of refinery barrels. Although thick as tar at room temperature, it was abundant and, at the time, remarkably cheap. General Electric's design would heat this oil until it flowed, inject it into the turbine's incandescent core, and unleash a torrent of rotational power. The concept appeared unstoppable. Union Pacific's board approved, and General Electric commenced construction of the initial prototype. In the minds of railroad executives, the age of steam was already on borrowed time. The next chapter promised to be written not in coal dust, but in the white-hot roar of a turbine roaring above the tracks. On a chilly spring morning in 1954, a single gas turbine locomotive departed the Cheyenne yard, its nose directed toward Sherman Hill. The challenging incline ahead had humbled generations of steam engines, but this time, the train would ascend without the aid of a helper engine. Crews lined the right-of-way to observe, reporters diligently took notes, and Union Pacific managers hovered by the radio, anticipating updates. As the turbine engaged, its jet-like whine eclipsed all other sounds across the high plains. The engine, pulling a full freight train, accelerated smoothly past the point where big boys would typically begin to strain. On the steepest section, the turbine maintained a speed exceeding 20 miles per hour, several miles faster than the best recorded steam runs. Timetables from that day revealed one locomotive accomplishing the work that once necessitated two, and doing so more rapidly. It was a triumph. The demonstration film of that run captured something extraordinary. A machine that seemed to flatten the mountain rather than merely climb it. Union Pacific's public relations office swiftly issued a press release, heralding a new era where a single crew in a single cab could transport more freight more swiftly and with less effort than ever before. Engineers in the cab reported an almost uncanny smoothness. No jarring rods, no billowing steam, just a consistent surge of power as the turbine's generator fed current to the traction motors. Over the radio, a dispatcher congratulated the crew as they effortlessly crested the summit. For a fleeting moment, it appeared that the future had arrived precisely as anticipated. The statistics from that day, gross tonnage, elapsed time, speed over grade, became the central focus of Union Pacific's board meetings and trade journal articles. The turbine had conquered Sherman Hill, the ultimate test, and done so with remarkable aplomb. The company's optimism soared. If this was what jet-age power could achieve on the most challenging route in the West, what limitations could possibly remain? The first true test of the turbine's promise didn't appear in a press release. It emerged in the operating logs. Engineers monitoring the figures along the main line observed that the fuel gauges were depleting faster than anticipated. The turbine's voracious appetite for bunker C oil became impossible to ignore. Records from the Cheyenne yard revealed a metric that would ultimately plague the program. 12 to 15 gallons of fuel consumed for every mile of track. This figure starkly contrasted with initial projections. By comparison, diesel locomotives pulling similar freight consumed less than half that amount. While the power was undeniable, the scales were already tipping. A note scrawled in the margin of one engineer's logbook read, "She runs strong, but she drinks like a fish." The turbine delivered on power, but the cost accumulated with every refueling. Fuel tenders, designed to extend operational range, now seemed barely adequate. Crews found themselves needing to refill at every major terminal, sometimes waiting while the heavy oil was heated sufficiently to flow, as bunker C behaves like tar and requires warmth. The turbine's smooth ascent over Sherman Hill came at a price, one not publicized in headlines, but reflected in the monthly invoices for bunker C. Union Pacific accountants began running their own calculations. The more they scrutinized, the more the myth of efficiency unraveled. Maintenance logs and ledgers showed the fuel bill was double, sometimes triple, what a comparable diesel would cost for the same work. The ledgers, once filled with optimism, began to show a deficit. Managers grew concerned about how long the railroad could afford to sustain this hungry new machine. By then, the question was no longer whether the turbine could outperform the big boy, but whether it could outrun its own exorbitant fuel consumption. Inside the Cheyenne roundhouse, the initial promise of turbine simplicity yielded to a grueling routine. Early optimism regarding fewer moving parts waned, as shop logs filled with reports of turbine blade replacements and clogged fuel lines. Bunker C oil, thick as tar, left a residue of ash and grit that eroded the core of each engine. Maintenance records from the late 1950s indicated a steady rise in downtime. What began as 20% of a unit's operational life spent in the shop soon approached 50% within a few years. For every day a turbine operated on the main line, another day was lost to blade inspections, fuel system flushes, and generator repairs. The contrast with diesel locomotives was striking. Standard diesels could be repaired with readily available parts from any division. Turbine units, however, sat idle for weeks, awaiting shipments from General Electric's factory back east. A foreman's note from 1961 lamented, "We can fix a diesel with a wrench and a part off the shelf. With these turbines, we sometimes wait a month for blades." Each overhaul demanded specialized skills possessed by few mechanics. Crews had to learn on the job, sometimes through trial and error, and sometimes by consulting General Electric engineers for guidance. The roundhouse transformed from a routine service facility into a virtual hospital ward for giants. The longer a turbine remained inactive, the more it cost. Payroll and parts bills escalated, and the railroad's initial faith in jet-age power was replaced by increasing frustration. The numbers spoke for themselves. The more technologically advanced the machine, the more time it spent behind shop doors, awaiting a remedy that never seemed to provide a lasting solution. Laundry lines stretching across backyards in Laramie didn't stand a chance. Residents began to notice linens and garments arriving in their homes, marked with oily, sooty stains that defied all attempts at washing. The source of the problem was easily identified. The exhaust from the turbine locomotives, dense with Bunker C residue, which drifted over neighborhoods as the trains roared past. Records from city council meetings in 1959 documented a sharp increase in complaints. One inhabitant penned a letter stating that the air felt heavier and more polluted than anything left by the old steam engines. The pervasive odor was impossible to ignore. A heavy, lingering scent of burnt oil that settled into porches and open windows. Families residing along the railway tracks started to organize, inundating the railroad office with calls, some expressing anger, others pleading for a solution. A mother at a council meeting lamented that her baby's clothes were ruined, remarking that the town had sought progress, not this outcome. The railroad dispatched representatives to town halls, promising cleaner fuel mixtures, but the issue never truly dissipated. Engineers tried adjusting injection settings in pursuit of a clearer burn. Nevertheless, records show that the fundamental chemistry of Bunker C made a clean exhaust almost unattainable. As Bunker C is a dense, tar-like fuel demanding heat and specialized handling that the steam era had not required. Pressure mounted for Union Pacific to divert the turbines away from urban centers, but the engines were too valuable for primary routes to be sidelined. Consequently, the company modified schedules, running turbines during off-peak hours to mitigate the most severe complaints. Yet, the persistent stains continued, and community frustration remained unabated. The financial records would soon reflect not only the expenses of fuel and maintenance, but also the cost of diminished public trust, an expenditure no one had anticipated when the turbine was merely a concept on General Electric's drawing board. Within Union Pacific's accounting department, The narrative of the turbine fleet condensed into two key metrics: cost per mile and operational readiness. Operating spreadsheets from the early 1960s revealed a striking disparity. While a diesel-electric unit could transport freight for 8 to 12 cents per mile, the turbine's cost soared as high as 24 cents. This gap widened with each invoice as fuel, parts, and workshop labor accumulated, undermining the initial promise of jet-age efficiencies. Financial managers highlighted these figures in red ink. One internal memorandum, appended to a monthly report, cautioned that the turbines were depleting budgets twice as rapidly as their diesel counterparts. Availability reports presented a similar narrative from a different perspective. Standard diesels routinely left the yard, ready to perform their duties 85% of the time. Turbines, in contrast, were available for work only 40 to 60% of the time in their later years. Workshop downtime became habitual rather than exceptional. Each week a turbine remained idle, awaiting components or repairs. The railroad bore the cost of a machine incapable of moving a single freight car. For the finance team, these were not abstract numbers. They were ominous warnings. Every increase in per-mile cost and every reduction in availability eroded the justification for keeping the turbines in operation. The ledger, once filled with optimistic projections, transformed into a chronicle of escalating losses. By the time oil prices began their ascent, the economic viability of the turbine program was already in decline. The decision to decommission the fleet would not originate in the repair shop or out on the main line. It would be made in the quiet confines of the accounting office, with only the stark reality of the figures remaining. In late 1973, oil prices experienced an almost instantaneous surge. The price of bunker C, once the cheapest and dirtiest fuel available, skyrocketed past anything Union Pacific's ledgers had ever recorded. Within months, what had been a manageable expense became a gaping financial wound. Finance memos from early 1974 indicated projections with fuel costs tripling and then quadrupling. The figures offered no room for optimism. On paper, every mile a turbine traveled now consumed more capital than it could ever generate. That spring, a quiet directive reached the desks of division managers. Mothball the turbine fleet. The order lacked theatricality. There were no news headlines, no formal ceremonies, just a line in an internal memo dated 1974, instructing shops to withdraw the engines from service and store them in the yards at Cheyenne and Green River. Locomotive numbers were systematically removed from rosters. By the close of 1974, the final turbine had rolled into storage, its destiny left to accountants and scrap merchants. Most of the fleet quickly vanished, dismantled for salvage and dispatched as scrap metal. However, 2 units evaded this fate. Museum acquisition logs from the late 1970s confirm their arrival. One at a railroad museum in the Midwest, and another at a heritage collection in the West. A curator, standing beside the silent hulk of a turbine, once remarked, "We preserved this one because it embodies the story of ambition, of how far you can reach and how swiftly it can disappear." The remainder of the fleet now exists solely in faded photographs and the recollections of those who witnessed their thundering passage, once convinced they were observing the future. Today, rail technology continues its pursuit of innovation. Yet the turbine's demise serves as a caution that sheer power is meaningless if it cannot withstand the practical costs of the real world. As railroads explore hydrogen, batteries, and novel fuels, the lesson persists. Innovation alone does not guarantee success. Sustainability does. In every sector, the true measure is not what impresses on paper, but what endures on the tracks. Are we merely echoing past events, or have we finally grasped their lessons?